Imagine waking up. I mean, you open your eyes, and there is no ambient glow of a street lamp slipping through the blinds.
None at all.
Right? There's no hum of a refrigerator down the hall, no faint vibration of a distant highway. The darkness before dawn is genuinely, absolutely absolute.
You are completely enveloped in a sensory deprivation chamber of your own home.
Unless, of course, you've physically dragged yourself out from under heavy wool blankets, walked across freezing floorboards, chopped the wood.
And spent 10 minutes striking flint to catch a spark on damp tinder.
Exactly. I mean, if you haven't done all that, you're sitting in pitch black.
The physical environment just dictates everything about your existence in this era.
It really does. You're living in a young republic, one that is weak enough to get pushed around by European empires, but confident enough to think it's the center of the universe.
Yeah, that's a great way to describe the mindset.
And you don't know it yet, but over the next 10 years, every rule of how human beings interact with distance, with power, and with each other, it's all going to be completely rewritten.
It is a massive transition.
Right. So the sources we're looking at today for this deep dive focus entirely on a single transformative decade, the 1810s.
A fascinating period.
And the sources reveal that this isn't just some boring historical transition. It's a massive, high-stakes collision between grand ideals and brutal reality.
And that collision is really the absolute core of the Bannock leadership framework we're using to analyze these sources today.
Okay, let's unpack this. What exactly does that framework tell us?
Well, the 1810s sit directly on the fulcrum between the 18th century world of kings, sail, and candlelight and the 19th century world of factories, interconnected systems, and mass politics.
A total shift.
Right. And the framework asks a very specific, almost unforgiving question of the leaders and the everyday people of this era.
Which is?
When the old order breaks apart, do you build the world you believe ought to exist, or the world you believe can actually survive?
Wait, those shouldn't necessarily be mutually exclusive, though, right? I mean, if you're building a new nation, shouldn't your ideal world be the one that survives?
Yeah. In theory, yes, absolutely.
But I'm guessing not in practice?
Not in practice at all. Having a guiding vision is one thing. Dealing with conditions you absolutely cannot control, like geography, weather, international war, the biological limits of human muscle, that is a different beast entirely.
So it's that tension between idealism and pragmatism.
Exactly. That tension is going to follow us everywhere in these sources.
Okay, so before we can even touch the massive political battles of the decade, we really have to grasp just how heavy and resistant the physical world of January 1810 actually was.
You do. The physical constraints were everything.
Because I think we have a tendency to view missing technology as just, an inconvenience.
Like a temporary outage.
Right, like, oh, they didn't have Wi-Fi, they had to read books. But the sources paint a picture where missing technology literally just meant human labor.
Precisely. If there's no thermostat, you are the thermostat.
You're out there chopping wood.
You are. The house in 1810 isn't a place you go to rest after work. It is an economic complex.
Wow, an economic complex.
It is a factory that you and your family have to run constantly just to stave off freezing or starving.
So you're not just kicking back by the fire.
No, you are carrying hundreds of gallons of water a week by hand. You are rendering animal fat to dip candles so you can see for an extra hour at night.
Which sounds exhausting.
It was. You are growing, harvesting, and chemically preserving every calorie you consume.
Which completely shatters that romanticized American myth of the rugged lone wolf pioneer.
Oh, completely.
Because, I mean, if you're out in the woods by yourself in 1810, you don't thrive. You die.
You absolutely die. The sheer caloric output required to run a pre-modern household meant that independence was largely an illusion.
Oh, that's interesting. An illusion.
Yeah, everyone was deeply dependent on their family, their extended kin, and their neighbors. A household couldn't survive without every single member, including young children, contributing physical labor to the system.
And this was the reality for the vast majority of the population, right?
It was. The 1810 census counts roughly 7.24 million people in the United States.
Okay, 7.24 million.
And to put the scale into perspective, only 46 places in the entire country meet the demographic criteria to be called urban.
46. That is tiny.
New Orleans, which is already this incredibly vital commercial hub controlling the mouth of the Mississippi, has a population of just about 17,000 people.
That's the size of a modern high school football stadium on a Friday night.
Exactly.
And the spaces between these tiny hubs are just oceanic. I mean, the sources mention that crossing the Atlantic takes 3 to 4 weeks, assuming you don't hit a storm.
Right, the ocean is a massive barrier.
But what really blew my mind was the domestic travel. Going from New York to Washington, D.C., which I could drive today between breakfast and lunch, took multiple days by stagecoach.
And we have to understand the mechanics of that travel.
Right, it wasn't a scenic road trip.
Not at all. A stagecoach wasn't a relaxing ride. You are crammed into a wooden box with strangers, bouncing over deeply rutted, unpaved roads that turn to impassable mud every time it rains.
Sounds miserable.
And rivers often didn't have bridges. You had to wait for a ferryman. The physical distance carried a massive psychological weight.
How so?
Well, if a family member moved west to the Ohio Valley, they were essentially disappearing from your daily life.
Out of sight, out of mind, but literal.
A letter could take a month, handed off from traveler to traveler, or it might never arrive at all. You could be carrying on your daily life for weeks before finding out a parent had died.
So the physical world is incredibly heavy, incredibly slow, and requires massive amounts of human muscle just to maintain the status quo.
That is the baseline, yes.
But right in the middle of this static reality, the sources point to 1811 as the year the future suddenly reaches the hull, so to speak.
Yes. The steamboat New Orleans makes a historic voyage down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers.
And why is that specific voyage so important?
Because that voyage fundamentally alters human history's relationship with geography.
That is a big statement.
Before steam, a river like the Mississippi was an absolute dictator. You obeyed its current.
Right, the water goes one way.
Farmers in the Ohio Valley could load their crops onto flatboats and float them down to New Orleans easily enough.
Gravity does the work.
Exactly. But getting the boat back upstream? Impossible.
Wait, literally impossible.
Essentially, yes. They would literally break the wooden flatboats apart in New Orleans, sell the timber, and walk or ride horses hundreds of miles back north along the Natchez Trace.
I'm trying to picture the economic bottleneck there. You essentially have a one-way conveyor belt for your entire regional economy.
Exactly. But steam power changes the physics of the economy. The New Orleans proves that mechanical power can defeat the current.
So the river is no longer a dictator.
Suddenly, the river runs both ways on human schedules. You don't have to wait for the wind. You don't have to rely on 50 men using poles to push a boat upstream at 1 mile an hour. Mechanical power begins to replace muscle.
And we see the same thing happening on land, right? With the very beginnings of mechanized textile production.
Yes, the sources heavily emphasize the mills at Waltham, Massachusetts, starting around 1814.
But hold on, I'm struggling to see how a water-powered loom suddenly breaks the whole pre-modern world. Wasn't it just a slightly faster version of the spinning wheels people already had in their homes?
It seems that way, but it's deeper.
Why do the sources treat this as the crack in the foundation of the 18th century?
Because of the shift in where and how labor is organized, for centuries, textiles were made through the putting out system.
It's a putting out system.
Right. A merchant would give raw cotton or wool to a family. The family would spin it and weave it in their own home on their own schedule alongside their other farming chores.
So they were in control.
They controlled their time. The Waltham system took all the steps of making cloth carding, spinning, weaving, and put them under one single roof, powered by massive water wheels.
Oh, so it's not just about the machine being faster, it's about centralizing the human beings.
Precisely. To use the machine, the worker has to leave their home and go to the factory.
They have to commute.
Yes. They no longer dictate their own hours. The factory bell and the speed of the water wheel dictate their hours. It is the earliest transfer of autonomy away from the household and toward the centralized system. It's a slow transition in the 1810s, but it's the exact mechanism that will eventually dismantle the muscle-powered, localized world we just described.
Okay, but because that localized world is still the dominant reality in the 1810s, the physical isolation actually makes the young United States incredibly vulnerable.
Highly vulnerable.
Because if your entire economy relies on getting your raw materials out to the global market and importing manufactured goods back in, you are entirely at the mercy of whoever controls the oceans.
That is the pragmatic reality.
And in 1810, the global chessboard is completely dominated by the Napoleonic Wars.
France, under Napoleon Bonaparte, controls almost the entirety of continental Europe.
And Napoleon is the ultimate case study for our framework of idealism versus pragmatism, isn't he?
He really is. The French Revolution birthed these massive ideals: the abolition of feudal privileges, legal equality, meritocracy.
Things we generally consider good today.
Yes, but by 1810, Napoleon is imposing those ideals as an absolute emperor.
Right. It's a terrifying contradiction. He's spreading the Napoleonic Code, which modernizes the legal systems of Europe, but he's doing it by marching hundreds of thousands of men across the continent.
Crushing local governments, installing his brothers as kings, and enforcing strict censorship.
It's liberation at the point of a bayonet.
Exactly. And he is able to do this because of a specific mechanism the revolution created,
Yeah.
the levée en masse, or universal conscription.
Okay, how did that change things?
Before the revolution, European armies were relatively small professional forces. Kings couldn't afford to lose them.
Because training them was expensive.
Right. The French Revolution said that because the nation belongs to the citizens, every citizen owes their life to defend the nation.
So Napoleon didn't just have better tactics. He had a seemingly infinite disposable workforce for his wars.
He could absorb casualties that would bankrupt any other monarch. He militarized the entire demographic weight of France.
That is horrifying, but incredibly effective.
But eventually, the pragmatism of geography defeats him.
The invasion of Russia.
Yes. In 1812, he invades Russia with an army of over 600,000 men.
600,000.
The logistical supply lines required to feed over 500,000 men and hundreds of thousands of horses by horse-drawn wagon are mathematically impossible over those distances.
The math just doesn't work out.
The Russians simply retreat, burn their own crops and cities, including Moscow, and let the Russian winter destroy the French supply chain.
It's a catastrophic failure of systems.
A whole failure.
He limps back with a fraction of his army, abdicates in 1814, gets exiled, makes a brief comeback, and is finally destroyed at Waterloo in 1815.
And when the smoke clears, the powers of Europe have to figure out how to put the continent back together.
Which brings us to a massive diplomatic event. The sources spent a lot of time on the Congress of Vienna.
Yes, this gathers statesmen like Metternich of Austria, Castlereagh of Britain, and Tsar Alexander I of Russia.
Now, if I remember my high school history, the Congress of Vienna is often taught as a room full of reactionary aristocrats simply trying to turn the clock back to 1789.
That is the common narrative, yes.
But the sources reveal a much more complex, deeply pragmatic calculus, don't they?
What's fascinating here is that these men had just survived 25 years of continuous apocalyptic warfare.
Right.
Warfare that killed millions of people and destroyed entire economies.
So if your highest ideal is peace, how much political idealism are you willing to suppress to get it? I mean, their definition of success isn't necessarily ideological purity.
Exactly. It's just stopping the bleeding. Metternich, the Austrian chancellor, looked at the French Revolution and concluded that ideological politics, the idea that abstract principles of liberty and rights should dictate how a state is run, was a virus.
A virus. Wow.
The French Revolution had promised that principles should lead to politics. Metternich believed the exact opposite.
Which was?
That rigid stability must precede politics. If you don't have stability, you just get the guillotine and 25 years of war.
So they essentially designed a massive geopolitical shock absorber.
That's a great analogy.
They restore the old Bourbon monarchy in France because a legitimate king is predictable. They create buffer states, combining smaller territories around France's borders to physically block any future French expansion.
They are building a literal balance of power so that no single nation has the capacity to overrun the others.
But wait, you can't just put the kings back on their thrones, draw some lines on a map, and pretend the last quarter century didn't happen?
No, you can't.
Because millions of common people had been mobilized. They had learned the vocabulary of nationalism, of constitutions, of the idea that sovereignty comes from the people, not God.
That is the tragic flaw in the Congress of Vienna's pragmatism. They achieved their goal. They largely prevented a continent-wide war in Europe for the next century.
Which is a massive achievement.
It is. But they did it by driving a massive lid down onto a boiling pot of nationalism.
Just to stop the kitchen from burning down.
Exactly. They suppressed the very ideas that the people had already internalized. The kings returned, but the psychological landscape of the people they were ruling had fundamentally changed.
Okay, so while Europe's leaders are choosing pragmatic stability over revolutionary principles, the United States is dealing with the exact opposite crisis.
The young republic is in a very different position.
America is overflowing with massive ideological principles, liberty, national honor, the rights of neutral nations.
But completely lacks the practical power to enforce any of it.
The U.S. is caught in the crossfire of the Napoleonic Wars. Britain, with its absolute naval supremacy, is blockading Europe to starve Napoleon out.
A brutal blockade.
And to enforce this, the Royal Navy is constantly stopping American merchant ships in the middle of the ocean. But it's not just about seizing cargo. It's the impressment.
Yes, impressment is key here.
I think we need to explain how this actually worked because it sounds like simple piracy. But the sources show Britain had a very specific legal justification for it, right?
Yes, the mechanics of impressment are crucial. The British Royal Navy in this era was a floating hell for sailors.
Brutal discipline, terrible food, low pay.
Consequently, thousands of British sailors deserted, and many found work on American merchant ships where the pay was vastly better.
Makes sense.
The British government maintained the doctrine of inalienable allegiance. Once an Englishman, always an Englishman. They did not recognize the right of a British subject to simply become an American citizen.
So a heavily armed British warship pulls up alongside an unarmed American merchant vessel.
Yes.
British officers board the ship, line up the crew, and essentially try to guess who is a British deserter based on their accent or lack of pristine documentation.
And because documentation in the 1810s was incredibly easy to forge, and because Americans and Britons looked and sounded very similar,
Right.
the British officers frequently just kidnapped American-born citizens and forced them into a lifetime of servitude in the Royal Navy.
That is just wild to think about.
They estimated they needed 100,000 men to keep their fleets running against Napoleon. They didn't particularly care if they grabbed a few thousand actual Americans in the process.
Which is an existential insult to American sovereignty.
Completely.
I mean, if you are a young nation and a foreign power can literally pull your citizens off your ships and enslave them in their navy, and you do nothing, are you even a real country?
That is exactly the argument of the war hawks in Congress.
Young politicians like Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun.
They are furious. They demand war to defend the nation's honor.
It is the ultimate test of the Bannock framework.
It is. The ideal national honor in defending citizens demands war. The pragmatic reality screams that war is suicide.
Because the United States in 1812 has a tiny, scattered professional army.
And it has a handful of frigates against the largest navy in human history.
It's David and Goliath, but David doesn't have a slingshot.
Furthermore, the Democratic-Republican Party of Thomas Jefferson and James Madison had spent the last decade intentionally dismantling the federal government's capacity to fight a war.
Wait, really? Intentionally?
Yes, they hated centralized power, so they let the charter of the National Bank expire in 1811.
Meaning they had no mechanism to borrow money to fund a military.
None.
But the ideals win. President Madison signs the Declaration of War in June 1812.
And the reality check is immediate and brutal.
The American strategy relies heavily on invading British Canada.
Yes, assuming the Canadians will welcome them as liberators and the British won't be able to defend it while fighting Napoleon.
And I'm guessing that didn't happen.
The invasion is a logistical nightmare. American state militias often refuse to cross the border into Canada, arguing they are only legally required to repel invasions, not launch them.
Oh, wow. Legal loopholes in the middle of a war.
Supply chains collapse in the wilderness.
Yeah.
The American forces face highly disciplined British regulars, Canadian militias who definitely do not want to be liberated, and a brilliant alliance of indigenous nations.
It gets so bad that by August 1814, the British sail the fleet right up the Chesapeake Bay, land an army, march into Washington, D.C., and set the Capitol on fire.
A devastating blow.
They burn the Capitol building, the Executive Mansion, the Treasury. The President of the United States has to flee into the woods on horseback. The physical vulnerability of the Republic is exposed to the entire world.
But then we see how the slow speed of information in the 1810s creates one of the most bizarre psychological twists in history.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
By late 1814, both sides are exhausted. Napoleon has been defeated in Europe, so the British don't need to impress sailors anymore.
The underlying cause of the war is basically gone.
Yes. Diplomats meet in Belgium and sign the Treaty of Ghent in December 1814. The treaty essentially says, let's stop fighting and return all borders to exactly where they were before the war started.
It resolves almost none of the ideological issues that caused the war.
Correct. But because it takes a month for a ship to carry that piece of paper across the Atlantic, the war on the ground keeps going.
Because nobody knows the treaty was signed.
Exactly. Down in Louisiana, Major General Andrew Jackson has assembled a deeply chaotic defense force.
Regular army, frontier militia, free black battalions, Choctaw warriors, and literal pirates.
Yes, to defend New Orleans from a massive British invasion fleet. In January 1815, weeks after the peace treaty was signed in Europe, the British attack Jackson's fortified lines.
And what happens?
The British suffer a catastrophic defeat. Thousands of British casualties in a matter of hours compared to barely a handful of American losses.
Wow.
It is a stunning, overwhelming tactical victory.
And because of the speed of information, news of Jackson's miraculous victory reaches Washington, D.C. at almost the exact same time as the news of the peace treaty.
The timing is incredible.
So I want to unpack the psychology of this. On paper, the war was a disaster. The Treasury is bankrupt, the capital is literal ash, and the treaty gained no
The
territory.
pragmatic results were terrible.
But psychologically,
Yeah.
it's like stepping into the ring with the heavyweight champion of the world,
Yeah.
getting your face entirely bashed in, but because you're still standing when the bell rings, you walk out feeling invincible.
That psychological shift is everything. The young republic survived. The people feel an immense surge of nationalism.
And it completely annihilates the political opposition.
Yes, the Federalist Party, which was centered in New England, had heavily opposed the war because it destroyed their shipping economy.
They were ready to jump ship.
Late in 1814, they had held the Hartford Convention to discuss constitutional amendments to limit Southern power, and some radicals even hinted at New England seceding from the Union.
Oh, wow. Secession in 1814.
Yes, so when the war ends in this burst of patriotic glory, the Federalists look like treasonous defeatists. They evaporate as a national political force.
But what does this mean for Madison and the Democratic Republicans? Because they started the war believing that a strong federal government was a threat to liberty.
The act of surviving the war forces their ideology to fundamentally adapt. The sources show a remarkable pragmatic pivot.
How so?
Madison looks at the smoking ruins of Washington and the near bankruptcy of the government and realizes that you cannot defend a republic with just agrarian ideals.
You need actual systems.
To protect liberty from foreign empires, you need centralized capacity. So in 1816, the very party that killed the First National Bank charters the Second Bank of the United States to manage the currency.
A complete 180.
They pass protective tariffs to encourage domestic manufacturing so they won't be dependent on British goods in the next war. They authorize funding for coastal forts and infrastructure.
So they barely survive this war. Their capital is ash. But psychologically, they feel invincible. And now they have the centralized tools to act on that confidence.
Exactly.
Does that energy just sit there, or do they immediately try to use it?
Oh, they immediately spend it geographically. The post-war era kicks off a massive surge of westward expansion.
Moving west.
Between 1812 and 1819, 5 new states enter the Union: Louisiana, Indiana, Mississippi, Illinois, and Alabama.
That is rapid growth.
The federal government begins pouring money into the National Road, a massive infrastructure project designed to punch a reliable route through the Appalachian Mountains to connect the eastern seaboard to the Ohio River Valley.
But this expansion brings us face to face with the most glaring, uncomfortable contradiction of the 1810s. The sources highlight this repeatedly.
Yes, they do.
We have a rapidly expanding map fueled by the rhetoric of freedom and opportunity. But we have to look closely at who that freedom actually belongs to.
We cannot adopt the 19th century mythology of a vast, empty wilderness waiting patiently for white pioneers to tame it.
Right, the land wasn't empty.
Not at all. The land being claimed was already inhabited, governed, and spiritually understood by powerful indigenous nations.
These were complex political entities making incredibly difficult strategic choices about how to survive this demographic tidal wave coming from the east.
And the most profound strategic response in this era is organized by Tecumseh, the Shawnee leader.
We mentioned earlier that indigenous alliances fought with the British in the War of 1812.
Yes. Tecumseh's vision is staggering. He recognizes that individual tribes signing piecemeal treaties with the United States is a death sentence.
Because the U.S. will just divide and conquer.
Exactly. So he travels endlessly from the Great Lakes down to the Gulf Coast, trying to build a massive pan-indigenous military and political confederacy.
What was his core argument?
His legal and moral argument was that the land was granted by the Great Spirit to all native peoples collectively. Therefore, no single chief or nation had the right to sell any portion of it to the Americans without the consent of all.
That is a brilliant structural response to American expansion.
It was. And when the War of 1812 began, allying with the British was a strictly pragmatic calculation.
The enemy of my enemy is my friend.
The British didn't want American settlers moving west either. They wanted a permanent native buffer state in the Midwest to protect their own interests in Canada.
But the strategy collapses when Tecumseh is killed at the Battle of the Thames in 1813.
Yes. For white Americans, his death is celebrated as a victory that secures the frontier. For indigenous sovereignty, it is a catastrophic loss of leadership and unity.
And the sources show this dispossession accelerating in the South as well.
Yes, during the Creek War. What began as a civil war within the Creek Nation over how to respond to American cultural and economic pressure eventually drew in American forces led by Andrew Jackson.
Jackson again.
At the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in 1814, Jackson's army decimates the traditionalist Red Stick faction.
And the aftermath is brutal.
Following the battle, Jackson dictates a treaty forcing the Creek Nation to cede nearly 22 million acres of land to the U.S. government.
22 million acres.
And cruelly, this land grab included territory belonging to Creek factions who had actively fought alongside Jackson as allies.
He just took it all, regardless of who was on his side.
Yes.
And Jackson operates with this terrifying unilateral momentum. I mean, a few years later, he essentially invades Spanish Florida on his own initiative.
Pursuing Seminole forces and runaway slaves, capturing Spanish forts along the way.
He creates an international diplomatic crisis. He had no direct orders to conquer Florida.
He was a rogue actor in many ways.
But Secretary of State John Quincy Adams looks at the situation, sees that Spain is too weak to defend the territory, and pragmatically uses Jackson's aggression as leverage.
It's ruthless pragmatism.
He essentially tells Spain, we can't control our general, and you can't defend your borders, so you might as well sell it to us before he takes the rest.
This results in the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819, officially securing Florida for the United States.
Which brings us back to the core contradiction of the era's economic growth. The millions of acres of land stripped from indigenous nations in the Deep South, combined with the acquisition of Florida, become the physical foundation for the explosive expansion of white American wealth.
But simultaneously, that exact same land becomes the engine for the massive expansion of human slavery.
We love the story of pioneers moving west for freedom. But what if the exact same road that means opportunity for a white settler means forced separation for an enslaved person being sold south?
And dispossession for a Creek family.
Right. A road isn't morally neutral. It just accelerates whoever controls it. And the historical records from this decade force us to look at this deeply uncomfortable duality.
The mechanics of this shift are vital to understand. In 1808, the United States legally banned the importation of enslaved people from Africa and the Caribbean.
Many idealistic politicians believed this would cause slavery to naturally wither away.
But pragmatically, the invention of the cotton gin had changed the math. The gin mechanized the removal of seeds from short staple cotton,
Which is a variety that could grow almost anywhere in the newly conquered Deep South.
Suddenly, cultivating cotton is insanely profitable, but it requires massive amounts of labor.
So if planters in Mississippi and Alabama can't import enslaved workers from overseas, where do they get them?
From the older eastern states, states like Virginia and Maryland had shifted away from labor-intensive tobacco toward wheat, leaving them with a surplus of enslaved workers.
The result is the horrific explosion of the domestic slave trade.
An estimated 1 million enslaved people would eventually be sold from the Upper South to the Deep South.
They were commodified into a highly organized national market. We see records of banks financing human purchases, insurance companies writing policies on human cargo,
And massive coffles groups of chained men and women being marched hundreds of miles down those exact same new roads to the frontier.
For an enslaved person, Western expansion didn't mean opportunity. It meant the constant, terrifying threat of being sold away from your spouse, your parents, or your children forever.
Returning to the Bannock framework, this represents a profound structural compromise.
The young nation was building a supposedly successful economic ship, but it was doing so by treating a massive portion of its inhabitants as expendable fuel for the engine.
Yet, even within this oppressive system, we see immense resistance. Free Black Americans in northern cities are actively fighting to make the ideals of the Republic real.
Richard Allen in Philadelphia is a perfect example.
Yes. Facing intense discrimination in white congregations, he helps found the African Methodist Episcopal Church in 1816.
It becomes the first fully independent Black denomination in the country.
They are building their own spiritual and social institutions, demanding access to the civic life that the nation's founding documents promised.
So we have a physical map that is expanding incredibly rapidly, stretching the demographic fabric of the country thinner and thinner across vast distances.
And the isolation of this environment created a psychological world where uncertainty was the absolute baseline of existence.
If you are living on the edge of that expanding map, the information environment is terrifying. News doesn't flow in a stream. It arrives in sudden violent bursts.
Exactly.
A rider comes into town, or a newspaper from a month ago arrives on a boat, and suddenly you find out the country is at war, or the price of wheat has collapsed, or a distant relative is dead.
You are navigating by the stars because you literally can't see the water right in front of the boat.
You are constantly making life-or-death decisions based on information that is weeks out of date.
And nature was a constant looming threat over every decision. Medical science in the 1810s was entirely pre-modern.
There was no understanding of germ theory.
None. The sources document surgical practices of the era, and without anesthesia, surgery was horrific.
I can't even imagine.
Survival in an amputation depended almost entirely on the surgeon's physical speed to minimize shock and blood loss.
Speed was everything.
A skilled surgeon with a Liston knife was judged on whether they could remove a limb in under 60 seconds. The margin for error in everyday life was practically zero.
And then the climate itself turns against them. The sources highlight 1816, which became known as the year without a summer.
Yes, a massive global event.
I had to read this section 3 times because the scale of it is so hard to grasp. In 1815, Mount Tambora, a volcano in Indonesia, erupts.
It is one of the most powerful volcanic eruptions in recorded human history.
It ejects so much sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere that it creates a global aerosol veil, physically blocking out a percentage of the sun's radiation.
The atmospheric physics of the eruption completely disrupted global weather patterns the following year.
In parts of New England, Canada, and Northern Europe, there was significant snowfall in June.
Hard frosts hit in July and August.
Imagine being a subsistence farmer in Vermont. You've planted your crops, it's the middle of summer, and you wake up to find your fields covered in ice.
Your entire food supply for the winter is dead.
The sources document widespread crop failures, massive spikes in food prices, and tens of thousands of people packing up their wagons and fleeing west, just desperate to find a climate where they wouldn't starve.
It's the ultimate proof that despite human beings debating constitutions and drawing borders, nature still held absolute veto power.
So how do you find psychological stability when the climate, disease, and the sheer distance of the frontier are actively working against your survival?
This raises an important question. You have to build social technology. You have to manufacture community.
Culturally, this era sees the explosion of the Second Great Awakening across the United States.
These were massive religious revivals, particularly the frontier camp meetings.
You would have thousands of isolated people traveling from miles around to gather in the woods for days at a time.
The sources describe these scenes of intense emotional release.
Preachers yelling from tree stumps, hundreds of people weeping, falling to the ground, and singing hymns together late into the night.
It's important to view these not just as religious events, but as a survival mechanism.
How so?
If you spend 350 days a year in grueling, isolated labor on a remote farm, surrounded by the dark, gathering with 3,000 other human beings to sing in unison is a profound psychological anchor.
It was the ultimate proof that you were part of a larger whole, that you weren't facing the wilderness entirely alone.
And we see that exact same anxiety about isolation, human limits, and the terror of nature reflected in the literature across the Atlantic.
Right. In 1818, Mary Shelley publishes Frankenstein.
It is the perfect distillation of the era's intellectual anxiety.
It's the story of humanity trying to conquer nature through science and technology, but failing to take responsibility for the interconnected consequences of what it creates.
Similarly, Jane Austen is publishing her major works during this decade.
Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, Emma.
While they might seem like polite drawing room romances compared to a gothic monster novel, Austen is actively mapping out a different kind of survival.
She is documenting the intense economic and social vulnerabilities of women under the legal doctrine of coverture.
Yes, let's explain coverture because Austen's plots don't make sense without it.
Okay, lay it out.
Under English common law, a woman's legal rights were essentially absorbed by her husband upon marriage.
A married woman, a femme covert, could not own property in her own name.
Could not sign contracts, and had no independent legal identity.
Therefore, Austen is showing us that for a woman in the gentry class, marriage was not primarily about romance.
It was a high-stakes, ruthless economic survival strategy.
Choosing the wrong partner, or failing to marry at all, meant potential financial ruin and dependency for the rest of her life.
Austen's characters are navigating a social system that is just as unforgiving and rigid as the physical systems we've been discussing.
But as the decade comes to a close, all this local isolation, the reliance on just your immediate neighbors, your local parish, your local economy, begins to fracture.
The world is becoming highly interconnected.
And the 1810s end with a brutal economic lesson. Interconnected systems can transmit pain and collapse just as efficiently as they transmit prosperity.
We see the scale of systems crashing both globally and domestically.
Let's start globally.
Globally, the Spanish Empire is disintegrating. Leaders like Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín have led incredibly difficult military campaigns to liberate South America from Spanish rule.
But as they succeed, they run headfirst into the pragmatic nightmare of our framework.
Right. Defeating the Spanish army is the ideal. But the morning after the victory, you have to govern.
Do you form a massive centralized republic?
Yeah.
Do you fragment into smaller independent states?
Bolivar dreamed of a united Gran Colombia, but the geographical barriers at the Andes, regional rivalries, and the lack of a shared political infrastructure make unity nearly impossible once the common enemy of Spain is gone.
Building the world you think ought to exist proves overwhelmingly difficult.
And domestically in the United States, we see an interconnected crash in the form of the Panic of 1819.
Following the War of 1812, the U.S. economy had experienced a massive boom.
Europe needed American agricultural products after decades of war. Cotton prices were sky high.
And to fuel the rapid westward expansion we discussed, local wildcat banks were popping up everywhere.
Printing paper money and lending it out freely to farmers and speculators buying land.
It's an entire economy built on speculative confidence.
But paper money in 1819 is only valuable if people believe it can be exchanged for actual gold or silver specie.
And the central institution, the second bank of the United States, realizes the economy is dangerously overextended.
So they decide to impose discipline. They start demanding that the local Western banks pay their debts to the national bank in hard gold and silver.
But the local banks don't have the gold.
So the local banks demand payment from the merchants.
The merchants demand payment from the farmers.
The farmers can't pay because European demand for American crops has suddenly dropped as their own farms recovered from the Napoleonic Wars.
The entire chain of credit snaps.
It's a total domino effect.
It's like tying 100 small rowboats together to cross a rough ocean. Yes, you have a bigger platform, and you won't capsize as easily from a small wave. You feel safer.
Until one boat takes on water.
Exactly. If just one or two boats get a hole and start sinking, the ropes will drag all the other 98 boats down to the bottom of the ocean with them. That's what this new interconnected credit system did.
The resulting depression is devastating. Land values plummet, businesses go bankrupt, and thousands of people lose their farms and end up in debtors' prisons.
A farmer in Ohio, who did nothing wrong, who worked his land and produced a good crop, suddenly loses his property because bankers in Philadelphia and merchants in London made policy decisions he couldn't even see.
That is the terror of the modern world arriving.
So what does this all mean? Before, if a local hailstorm wiped out your crop, you might starve, but it was a local, understandable tragedy. Now you are connected to an invisible global web that can ruin you from 3,000 miles away.
If we step back and look at the macro theme of these sources, the 1810s are not the story of full industrialization. There are no railroads or telegraphs yet.
It is the story of systems scaling up.
Yes, we are watching diplomacy, global commodity markets, the horrific logistics of the domestic slave trade, transportation networks, and political nationalism, all becoming massive interconnected webs.
The Panic of 1819 is the ultimate proof that humanity was learning how to coordinate incredible amounts of power across vast distances.
But they absolutely had not figured out how to control the shockwaves when the machine malfunctioned.
They built a larger ship, but they didn't know how to steer it through a storm without throwing half the crew overboard.
Which brings us to the harsh conclusion of the decade. The 1810s proved that the localized, muscle-powered 18th century world could be broken.
But it left the 1820s and beyond with the brutal, unresolved question of who possessed the power to dictate what replaced it.
Exactly.
What a heavy, epic journey. Let's recap what we've unpacked in this deep dive.
We started in the pitch-black, candlelight reality of 1810, where survival meant endless physical labor.
We watched the global shockwaves of Napoleon's catastrophic failure in Russia and the pragmatic, cynical map drawing at the Congress of Vienna.
We saw the young United States stumble into the War of 1812, watch its capital burn, and yet emerge with a fierce, transformative nationalism.
We tracked the steamboats defying river currents And we watch the map expand westward.
bringing the promise of opportunity for some, while simultaneously driving the devastating realities of indigenous dispossession and the commodification of enslaved humans.
And we ended with the bursting speculative bubbles of 1819 as the invisible web of a global economy snapped tight.
The leaders of the 1810s were constantly forced to abandon their idealized visions of the world and pragmatically manage the world that could actually survive the fires of war, geography, and human ambition.
And that leaves you with one final thought to mull over as we close out this analysis.
The modern parallel is impossible to ignore.
We've spent this deep dive watching the people of the 1810s build the very first primitive versions of massive interconnected systems, global trade, continental expansion, the shift to mechanical power.
Right.
Today, sitting in the 21st century, we live at the absolute extreme edge of that exact same experiment. Our systems are now entirely global, instantaneous, and highly fragile.
If the deepest lesson the sources offer about the 1810s is that a workable route isn't automatically a route worth taking, we have to ask ourselves some tough questions.
Are the massive technological and economic systems we are building right now actually serving the whole crew? Or are we making the exact same structural compromises they did, just executing them at the speed of light?
Because eventually, the map always burns.
And when our map burns, what stars are we going to navigate by? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the 1810s. Keep questioning the map, and we'll see you next time.